Chapter 8. Elizabeth leaned against the door, feeling like an intruder. The decoration of this room was much lighter than the rest of the house. It was obvious to her that this was the room the previous Countess had lived in. It seemed that nothing had been changed since the day the lady had died. Elizabeth steeled her nerves, reminding herself that if she were killed, she would not begrudge the Earl's next wife any information she might be able to glean from her things. With that thought, she set herself to a systematic search of the room. Clearly, Lady Barbara had loved her trinkets, Elizabeth thought as she examined the many bangles, feathers, and clips strewn about the room. And she had an extensive array of clothes. Elizabeth had thought she was well outfitted for this season and her new life as the Countess of Heath, but she felt dowdy in comparison to the Earl's first wife. Uncomfortable insecurity flooded her heart for a moment, before she reminded herself of Wesley's words. Lady Barbara might have been beautiful and fancy, but she hadn't made the Earl very happy. Becoming anxious about the amount of time that was passing, Elizabeth began to think she ought to end her search for the day and go busy herself with something else, when she came across what appeared to be a false bottom in one of the lady's smaller trunks. She set herself to the task of discovering how to open it. It had been well concealed, but not well locked. It was doubtful the lady had had the need to keep her things overly secure. Perhaps she had just been private. She almost crowed with delight when she discovered what appeared to be a diary when she finally managed to open the small space. Deciding that she had already spent too much time in there for one day, Elizabeth brushed off her skirts, tucked the book under her arm, and listened at the door for a tense moment before making her way back to her own bedroom. Shoving the diary into a drawer in her dressing table, Elizabeth forced her curiosity into submission before taking up her basket of needlework and making her way down to the morning room. Her timing was remarkably impeccable. She had just gotten herself settled and was getting to work when a knock could be heard resounding throughout the front of the house. Elizabeth glanced up, alert, wondering if the caller could possibly be for her or if it was someone to see the Earl. She wasn't left in suspense for long. Within moments, the butler came in to tell her that a Lady Eleanor Mead had called by to see if she was available to visit us. Elizabeth quickly put away her needlework and asked the butler to ring for tea after showing the visitor in. She politely got to her feet as a small, pleasant-looking woman was shown in. "Lady Sinclair, thank you for seeing me. What a pleasure to meet you. Am I your first caller?" Elizabeth couldn't help laughing at her first indication of the neighbourhood competition. "Why, yes, you are. Thank you for calling. It's my pleasure to meet you. Will you join me for a cup of tea?" "Thank you, I would love some." Lady Mead grinned with delight as she looked around the room with a curious gaze. Elizabeth was surprised to see the curiosity. Surely the woman has been here before, she thought. Why else would she be so keen to check on the new Countess if she had not visited the previous one? "I hope you don't consider my visit an intrusion," her guest began with charming hesitance. "I know you have just arrived and you are essentially honeymooning here with your husband. But Lady Worth was the previous Countess's first caller, and I just could not abide her crowing over it again." That struck Elizabeth as being the most hilarious thing she had heard in days, weeks even, and she couldn't help the fit of giggles which attacked her over Lady Mead's words. She was grateful that the elder lady, too, saw the humour in the situation, instead of taking offence at Elizabeth's response, and she joined in the laughter. "I shall be certain to be unavailable when Lady Worth comes calling," Elizabeth promised with a grin when she could get her giggles under control. "What a lovely offer, my lady. But you needn't go to such lengths on my behalf. Just getting the march on her this time will be sufficient." Lady Mead gazed at Elizabeth with approval. "I can tell already that we are going to be great friends." Elizabeth could feel her heart swelling with joy over the thought. She hadn't developed many friendships during her season, and had never had the experience of going away to finishing school, so she was gratified at the offer. She had been surprised to miss her sisters so fiercely, and hoped Eleanor could be a confidant in the coming weeks as she adjusted to a new life. Before they could get involved in conversation, the tea trolley was rolled in. Elizabeth dismissed the servants and poured for her new friend. Lady Mead launched into a recital of all the local gossip, informing Elizabeth of who was likely to be a good friend for her and who would no doubt tell tales about her. It crossed Elizabeth's mind to wonder which category Lady Mead would fall into. She had felt an impulse to pepper her with questions about Lady Barbara, but felt a pointed interest in her predecessor would be too juicy for the gossipy Eleanor to keep to herself. Perhaps, once they were better acquainted, Elizabeth could casually bring the subject up, but not here in her own drawing-room when any of the servants could hear, or even the Earl could walk in at any time. That thought brought a guilty blush to Elizabeth's cheeks, and she found herself glancing toward the door in fear that he might appear at any moment. "What could I have possibly said to put that look upon your face, my lady? I can assure you I am not revealing anything overly untoward. Everyone in the village will have all the exact same tales to share with you, I can assure you." Elizabeth's nerves got the best of her, and she once again began to giggle. "Well, I do appreciate being in the know, so I thank you. Now, please, tell me about you. Do you have a family? Have you lived around here long?" Lady Mead blinked. It would seem no one had taken an interest in her before. She appeared to be gratified by Elizabeth's questions. "Well, now that we're going to be friends, I do believe you are quite correct, my lady. We ought to know about one another. I have lived in this vicinity my entire life. I didn't even get a season. Married my lord right out of the schoolroom, I did, and never regretted it for a minute. Except for when in the future I might have to take my own daughters to town, and I'll be just as green as them." "Do you have daughters, my lady?" "Not yet," she began sadly, before continuing with a grin. "But not for a lack of trying. We have 3 fine boys running around our small estate, Fernwood, but I would surely like at least one girl to keep me company amongst all that manliness." Elizabeth was surprised with a jolt of instinctive desire for a child of her own. She tried to keep her smile in place, even as she shook her head to rid herself of the traitorous notion. She didn't feel inclined to have a murderer father her children. Itching to get back to Lady Barbara's diary, she eyed her companion and wondered if she should hint for her to leave, or if she should ask about the last Countess despite her misgivings. Lady Mead took the decision out of her hands as she got to her feet. "I suppose I've overstayed my welcome already? You are such an attentive listener. You must get that often. Do be sure to visit me at Fernwood at your earliest convenience." "Certainly before I visit Lady Worth," Elizabeth said with a smile and a wink, which caused Lady Mead's chuckle to fill the room. "Oh, my dear, his lordship the Earl is a very lucky man to have gotten a second chance at you." Elizabeth felt her jaw wanting to unhinge. It would have been the perfect opening if they were not already on their feet, with Eleanor preparing to leave. She began calculating how soon she could visit the other woman without appearing too eager. She had to content herself with a smile as she walked with her guest to the door. "It was lovely to have met you. Thank you for calling on me. I would like to get settled into the rhythms of life here as quickly as possible." "You needn't have any qualms about your reception, my lady. Everyone is going to be eager to meet you, and will make every effort to get on your good side. We'll all be doing our best to make you feel welcome." Elizabeth was glad the other woman was no longer looking at her, as she felt stunned by her words. She had quite overlooked the fact that she would most likely be the highest level of the local society. She wondered if she would be putting some other lady's nose out of joint with her very presence. Another, even more disquieting thought crossed her mind. Had Lady Barbara made enemies? Could one of the ladies have been angry enough to kill her? A cold dread settled over her. It was imperative that she find out what happened to the previous Countess. Elizabeth fled to her room and dug out the diary she had hidden in her dressing table. She scrambled to find another book, so that she could easily show that she had been reading should anyone come looking for her. She settled herself in the window seat, eager to read Lady Barbara's words. Before long she was heartily bored. She didn't want to miss anything, and so had started from the beginning of the book. There was clear evidence of what Wesley had been talking about. The young woman had been rather dispassionate about her conquests and clear about her determination to marry a lofty title. So many of her entries were about her gowns and shopping. Elizabeth could not fathom why the woman had felt it necessary to report on such dull subjects. It was for this very reason that Elizabeth herself did not keep a diary. She was of the opinion that her life was far too dull to write about. Well, until recently that was. And now she wouldn't want to risk writing any of the details down, since everything was so uncertain. With a sigh, She realized it was nearly time to ready herself for supper, and she still had learned very little of import. She had to put the book away and try again on the morrow. Frustration hung heavy on her shoulders. That evening, over dinner, the Earl filled her in on how the rest of his day had gone. Elizabeth struggled not to feel too gratified by his confidences. Her feelings were so conflicted. As they chatted over each course, the candles flickering, his deep voice washed over her in waves of attraction. She wondered bleakly how she was going to be able to endure this life. How can I possibly be falling in love with a potential murderer? The next day she took the gig for a drive to the nearby village. She had seen it from a distance as she had ridden out with the Earl. Now she wanted to check on the shops and see the village for herself. She had still not gotten far in the diary, and she felt an urgent need to get out of the house for a time, as though the other woman's previous existence was oppressing her. As she drove along the road to town, she shivered with a strange sense of foreboding. The leafless trees looked dead, and the grim, grey sky lent a melancholy air to the surroundings. Elizabeth had dressed warmly for this cold, late-autumn drive, but she feared it had not been enough. Resolutely, she refused to give in to her misgivings. She continued on toward the village. Once she arrived, she was glad she had made the effort. The village was small and cosy, and she was thrilled to meet people. True to Lady Mead's words, everyone she came across was more than ready to go out of their way to accommodate her. She decided, with a silent chortle of delight, she wouldn't overly mind getting used to such treatment. Then she met the vicar's wife and was quickly inundated with demands for her presence on various committees for the well-being of the local community. With a grin, she agreed to meet with the woman the following week to discuss it. Elizabeth fell back on the ready excuse that she would have to check with her husband. She felt a thrill in her heart at her own words. Perhaps all her concerns were for nothing. She could end up with her happy life, with a loving husband after all. The afternoon was advancing when she climbed back into the gig. Elizabeth had the strangest sensation that she was being watched. She reprimanded herself for being ridiculous. Word had swept through the village as to who she was, and many had turned out to get a look at her. Of course she was being watched, she scolded herself with a rueful shake of her head. But when she had left the village behind, she couldn't rid herself of the sensation. She flicked the reins, urging the horse to a faster pace. She did not enjoy the eerie feeling that was gripping her. Finally, she couldn't take the feeling any more. She craned around in her seat to look behind her. To her utter shock, there was a lone horseman behind her. It was not anyone she recognized, but being new in the district, that was nothing to be nervous about. But then she noticed that the man had his face covered in such a way that only his eyes showed. With an audible gulp, Elizabeth urged the horse even faster. She was almost certain they were nearly back to Heath. Then a shot rang out. Elizabeth screamed, feeling a pinch in her arm. She slid to the floor of the gig, slapping the reins on the back of the horse, who was running in true fear now. The horse headed for home. Elizabeth just kept her head down and prayed that she would make it safely. She didn't want to risk peeking to see if she was being followed. Someone had just tried to kill her. By the stables, the horse came to a standstill. Elizabeth was unable to move. Fear held her in its grip. She didn't realize how much noise she had been making as she made her mad dash into the stable yard. The head groom and other stable servants came running, all anxious over the new mistress. Within a blink of an eye, even the Earl was there. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth! Answer me, Elizabeth!" He had started yelling as he had caught sight of the gig. No one had even told him that the Countess had left until it was too late for him to accompany her. He had no one to blame but himself. He had thought to himself as he had paced the house, nervously awaiting her return. He had never told her not to go anywhere unaccompanied. He supposed it was one of the most appealing things about being a married lady, not needing to be chaperoned at all times. He tried not to be angry with her for taking advantage. He should have told her she wasn't to leave the estate without an escort. Now, all those thoughts were flung from his mind as he ran toward the gig his wife had taken to the village. As he got close, he could hear a soft whimper. Looking down onto the floor of the gig, he saw her huddled in a heap. "Elizabeth, my dear lady, can you speak?" He had to bite back an oath as she raised her pale, tear-stained face to his. "It's my arm, not my mouth, which is injured, my lord," she replied with a weak attempt at humour, before her eyes widened and her face became rather blank. "Does it hurt terribly?" he asked, trying to keep her talking, as he made an effort to get her out of the gig. "It does, rather. Did you see him?" "See who?" "The man who shot me," she explained with what sounded like aggravated patience. "You were shot?" he gasped, grabbing her from the floor of the gig. He had thought she had merely been spooked by something and had her arm wrenched when the horse took off. He quickly carried her to the house, yelling for the housekeeper to meet him in the Countess's room and demanding that the doctor be summoned. "I don't think you'll be able to find the doctor at his house, my lord," Elizabeth said. "He is attending Mrs. Baxter's birthing this afternoon. You really ought not to disturb him anyway. I believe it is just a scratch. Surely Mrs. Patrick and Pansy can look after me. Do you suppose you could go looking for the man who shot at me?" Justice marvelled at her calm acceptance of the situation. He suspected she might be in shock. With his wife still in his arms, he tried not to crush her, but he wanted to hold her forever and keep all threats away from her. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw Mr. Patrick watching. Worry made the older man wring his hands. "Mr. Patrick, please have the grooms and footmen ride out and search the area. Have them question anyone they come across that seems to be a stranger." He could see that the shock was fading from her eyes, but she was still regarding him with accusation. "Why would you only question the strangers, my lord?" "I cannot imagine that a friend would have done this," Justice explained. "Who is there to say who our friends are?" she countered with a bite in her tone. Justice didn't understand why she was sounding so cryptic, but he was more concerned about her injury and the threat against her. He could not bear to lose another wife. He had just gotten this one. "Did you manage to get a look at your attacker? What did he look like?" "I saw him, or I assume it was a man. He had his face covered with a cloth, so I can't tell you anything about him. He was riding a brown horse." Justice could see her eyes fill with tears, and he bit back more curses. He placed her gingerly on the bed. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Justice couldn't blame her for the accusatory look she had been giving him. It really was his fault, and she had no idea. Being in her presence consumed him with guilt. He left her in the capable hands of the housekeeper and her maid, while he left to run down her attacker. Elizabeth was relieved when the Earl finally left. He seemed so concerned about her. She didn't know what to think. What good would it do him to get rid of another wife when she had not even borne him an heir? From what she understood, Lord Sinclair was a wealthy man. She didn't really think her dowry was all that spectacular. She doubted he would be trying to kill her to keep his hands on her money without the inconvenience of a wife. She was leaning more towards thinking it might be someone who considered her a rival. But why had the Earl looked so stricken with guilt when he had realized she had been shot? Mrs. Patrick and Pansy had trouble remaining calm enough to help her out of a gown and see to a wound. As she had suspected, it wasn't a very deep cut. The bullet had merely grazed her. But it was bleeding profusely, and there was always the risk of infection. It made her laugh that she had to calm them down in order for them to be able to help her. Pansy was so frantic about her mistress, she was ready to pack their bags and head to Elizabeth's parents' estate within the hour. Mrs. Patrick was too worked up to fully comprehend what Pansy was implying, but Elizabeth understood and needed to broker peace amongst her staff. "Mrs. Patrick, Pansy, I know you are worried and frightened, but so am I, and I really need to get out of this gown." This brought them up short and moved them to action. Within a few short minutes, Elizabeth was out of her gown, cleaned, bandaged, into a night rail, and was gingerly climbing into a comfortable bed. Her mind did not at all feel ready to sleep, but her eyes were unable to stay open. Pansy refused to leave her side, sitting on a chair by her bed. At one point during the evening, Mrs. Patrick came in with a bowl of soup the cook had prepared, especially for their mistress. Pansy insisted the housekeeper had to taste some first, while she watched her with a gimlet eye. Elizabeth had awoken during this exchange and had to struggle to quell her reaction. Mrs. Patrick had huffed with dismay, but had done as Pansy had requested before turning on her heel and stomping from the room. As soon as the housekeeper was out of the room, Elizabeth struggled to sit up in the bed. Pansy cried out for her to stop, quickly put down the soup, and rushed over to assist her. Elizabeth had to laugh over her ministrations. "Pansy, I truly appreciate what you're trying to do, but I really don't think it is as serious as you were letting on. It seemed to me to be little more than a scratch." "Oh, no, my lady. There was so much blood, and the doctor hasn't even been by to look at it. You really need to be careful with yourself." Elizabeth couldn't be bothered to argue with her about that, as her arm really did hurt. It was beginning to feel as though it had been burned. She earnestly hoped there was no infection setting in. She remembered what had woken her up. "Pansy, might I ask why you had Mrs. Patrick taste my soup? I don't mind sharing, but that was a trifle strange." "My lady," Pansy began, as though explaining a simple thing to a child, "someone has just tried to kill you. I do not intend to allow anyone near you until we have gotten to the bottom of things." Elizabeth felt waves of heat and cold rippling over her, hot with gratification over the loyalty of her personal servant, cold with dread over the validity of her words. Someone had tried to kill her that afternoon. Mayhap Pansy was right and they should pack it in and go home. Her mother had not thought the potential threat was enough to keep her from marrying the Earl. But now that it was a reality, maybe she would be a little more accommodating. The soup was warm and soothing. Within moments, she was feeling ready to sleep some more. She was settling down into the warm covers when there was a soft knock on the door. Pansy went to see who it was. Elizabeth was just drifting off to sleep when Pansy came back to her bedside. "The Earl wishes you a speedy recovery," Pansy said in a low, sarcastic voice. "Did he not wish to come in?" Elizabeth was puzzled. "Well, of course he did, my lady, but I am not letting him anywhere near you while you are in a weakened state." Pansy was fierce in her determination, and Elizabeth felt tears prickle at the back of her throat. "I do not see how we can avoid the man forever." "Not forever, my lady, but at least until you have rested. I told him you were asleep, and he said he was going to have a footman at your door round the clock to run and fetch anything you might need. I think the man is trying to keep you a prisoner." Elizabeth felt a flutter of fear, but strove for reason. Or perhaps he is trying to guard us, to keep us safe. Pansy merely grunted softly, not wanting to disagree with her mistress openly, but obviously unwilling to agree. "Well, you can be sure I won't be leaving your side all night." "Oh, Pansy, you shan't be any use to me on the morrow if you are falling down with your own fatigue." The maid refused to be persuaded. Finally, Elizabeth convinced her to share her bed. "It will actually be a comfort to me, Pansy. It will feel like when I was a little girl and climbed into bed with one of my sisters, if ever I was frightened or wanting to chat. If it makes you feel any better, you can take the outside." That seemed to mollify Pansy, who was determined to guard her mistress from whatever malevolent creature was out to get her. Within moments, both girls were fast asleep. It was late at night when the doctor finally turned up to examine Elizabeth. She was groggy with sleep and reluctant to have her womb disturbed, but the kindly, gentle man insisted in a most reasonable way that she really must allow him to look at it. He fussed over her for a few moments, but then declared that the servants had done an excellent job of looking after her. "It seems like your wound is clean and should heal quite nicely, although I am sorry to tell you that there is likely to be a scar, my lady." "It shall be an exciting story to tell my grandchildren." She tried to maintain a brave face. The doctor left her to rest after giving instructions that she remain in bed the following day and drink plenty of liquids. "And he'll probably bill the Earl quite a tidy sum for that piece of instruction," Pansy scoffed after the doctor had left. Elizabeth couldn't help a weak giggle. "Are you not reassured, though, Pansy? I know I am. I knew you had done your level best, but just knowing that a doctor had seen to it makes me feel slightly better." Pansy was in no mood to agree to any such thing, merely tucking the covers around her mistress after helping her to sip some more tea that she had brewed herself over the fire in the room. She was refusing to take any chances with the servants at Heath. The two girls slept the rest of the night undisturbed. "How is she, Doctor?" the Earl asked anxiously as he hovered just outside his wife's room. He hadn't wanted to disturb the Countess while she was resting, and thought it might embarrass her to have him present while she was being examined. And, if he wasn't mistaken, her maid didn't want to let him enter anyway. According to the housekeeper, the Countess's maid thought everyone in the household was to blame for her mistress's wound. He really couldn't fault her. He felt as though it was his household's fault too. Here was a second Countess of Heath nearing death in such a short time. Perhaps he should have remained single and allowed his line to die out. The estate could pass to a distant cousin, or be absorbed by the crown. It would make no difference to him if he were to be condemned to a lonely existence. He felt like a worried old woman as he tried not to wring his hands while he waited for the doctor's verdict. "Your wife is young and healthy, my lord. There is no reason why she shouldn't make a full recovery. It wasn't an overly serious injury. I know Mrs. Patrick and her ladyship's maid both report that there was a great deal of blood, but that is actually a good thing in this case. It kept the wound clean, and now it has been properly bandaged, and it should heal very nicely." The doctor paused and regarded the Earl solemnly. "Your wife will be very tired for a few days after losing that much blood. She should be kept quiet and unexcited. Have you discovered what happened?" Justice felt his frustration rise at the doctor's question. "No," he almost growled. "Lady Elizabeth says she was shot, and a few others reported hearing what they think might have been a gunshot, but her ladyship did not get a good look at her assailant, and no one else has seen anyone out of the ordinary. I cannot believe one of my neighbours or servants has shot at my wife." Justice felt on the verge of despair. "It is rather strange that another wife of yours has been the subject of an attack." The doctor's tone was bland, but his eyes on the Earl were bright and attentive. Justice could feel himself blanch at the doctor's words, but he kept his gaze steady as he looked him right in the eyes. He had absolutely nothing to do with his first wife's death. While he felt sick with guilt over Elizabeth's injury, it was only guilt by association. He should have known she might be a target after what had happened to Barbara. "Strange is not the word that I would use, Doctor. Do you have any suggestions as to which direction I should take my investigation? Or do you have an accusation to make, perhaps?" The Earl knew he should be grateful that the other man was taking his wife's injury so seriously, but he could not allow the man to be sidetracked into thinking he was guilty. The doctor valiantly tried to stare down the Earl, but finally he allowed his gaze to drop. "I'm sorry, my lord. I don't have any suggestions for you. If I hear of anything around the village, I will be sure to let you know. And I will be back mid-afternoon tomorrow to check on her ladyship." With a nod, Justice dismissed the doctor. It wasn't the other man's fault. He would be suspicious of him too if he wasn't himself. He wondered if Elizabeth knew about his first Countess. His stomach clenched at the thought that she might actually be afraid of him. He must catch her attacker and get to the bottom of Barbara's death before something worse happened to Elizabeth. He went off in search of his men to regroup after their most recent search.